Thanks everybody for joining us. The bios of our panelists are in your packets, but briefly, Dr. Kelly Ditzel with the Southern Education Foundation is with us. Dr. Stephen Green, the superintendent in DeKalb County, who many of you probably know. Senator Fran Miller, who is chair of the Higher Education Committee and is very involved in K-12 education decisions in Georgia as well. And of course, Claire Suggs, who many of you know as one of the main education policy experts in the state of Georgia. So thanks everybody for joining the conversation. And my first question to all of you, and this is a conversation with the room, so feel free to interrupt us or raise your hand and ask a question. But my first question to everybody is, you've seen the Georgia Partnership's Top 10 Issues in Education report that came out today. You've heard a little bit about the Columbia Group report that we're doing across the region on the future of education in the South. And so my question to you is, if you have any thoughts on those things, but as it applies to your work, what's an issue that currently is not as much of a priority for policymakers and for educators as you wish it were, and why? What's something that's not getting the attention it deserves that these journalists and advocates need to know about as it affects your work? And so I thought we'd start with you, Kelly.
Hi, thank you. I'm Kelly Ditzel again, Director of Research and Policy for the Southern Education Foundation. And for those of you who may not be familiar, SEF was started in 1867, so it's been in existence for actually 150 years, so lots of rich history there. Intentionally started to educate those who are not, so previous slaves and poor whites. And in regard to your question, Alan, I think language is extremely important, and one potential issue is when talking about differences and equity and gaps, and what you just talked about even with the poll results, is not just talking about poverty and low income, but being explicit about race. That there are differences that exist. In the top 10, I was looking, I think it's page 10, Dana outlined differences in achievement for Black and white students and also economically disadvantaged. And so you can actually see that there are still gaps, regardless of SES being low income or not, racial gaps still persist. We recently had our forum that was focused on advancing bold solutions for education in November and had some phenomenal keynote speakers, and one of them was Nicole Hannah-Jones. And she pointed out that looking at differences in Black and white achievement, the gap was actually the smallest in 1988 when integration was at its height, and now it's increased since then. So these are considerations that I think are very important to consider for policy and most importantly outcomes for our students.
Thanks, Kelly. Dr. Green, any thoughts on kind of what needs to be more of a priority in education? That I'm sure there's a long list, but as affects your world as a county superintendent.
Yeah. How much time can I give them? No. I think what's emerging, it's not emerging, it's really been there all along, but we're starting to feel the weight of it in public education more so than ever before, has to do with the social emotional well-being of our children and their families, and the mental health component as that affects, as poverty affects that, and as that as an outgrowth of what manifestations what we see in the classroom are in some ways very correlative to some of the things that need to be addressed. So why do I have a team of social workers and school psychologists more and more feeling the need to, as part of that wraparound support that you talked about, fill a gap that clearly exists that families are in need of for a variety of different reasons. It could be episodic, it could be chronic, but it's still a need, and in order to get to the the instructional side of things, which is kind of what taxpayers look for us to provide, the other types of needs that families have, both the student and the family, not just the student in isolation, but the student in context with his or her family, those things are becoming more and more visible and more pronounced, and we as a school system are being called upon to find the funds to render service to families in need.
I heard that very same thing across the South in urban communities, rural communities, suburban communities, that it's an incredible need and that we sort of haven't caught up with it as a system for what students need. Fran, any thoughts on kind of what's missing?
I think I would piggyback on what Steve said. I have served on 2 education reform commissions, the first under Governor Perdue, IE squared, which meant it cost too much, so it was shelved. And the second being under Governor Deal. We dance around the fact that, now, I think there were some very good recommendations came out of the second one with Governor Deal's office, particularly for once we were going to, when we revised the formula, simplify it as respects young people with disabilities. For the first time ever, hard to believe, I know, but we actually had a poverty factor in there. It's hard to believe we don't have that in there. So when Steve's talking about the, I'll call you Steve. When Steve's talking about when he's talking about the wraparound services, you have to have a way to pay for them. And I think there's a greater awareness today. I mean, we live in different times, okay? When I grew up, not that many mothers worked. By and large back then, it was the father, if you will. We've got so many different types of families today that we ever had from 20 years ago, 30 years ago. In my case, 50 years ago plus. I'll be kind to myself. So I do think that we've danced around this thing. There's some bills pending in the legislature about using M&O money, possibly another penny if it would be for local districts to do that, or take part of the SPLOST monies for this, that, or the other. We got technology issues. We've all heard about broadband, particularly in rural areas, or in my living room. So we're dancing around that fact. I think, quite frankly, I think when the Opportunity School District went down 60-40 vote, I think took a lot of air out of the room. I don't expect this to be addressed this year. I hope the next governor, once again, will embrace, if you will, the need to redo this formula and get it updated. I think that's a big issue. The other issue, and this I fault the professional educators, I fault the business community, we still don't have enough emphasis on career readiness versus everybody going to a 4-year college. We continue to delude ourselves and delude our children, our young people, when our 6-year graduation rate at our colleges is 56%. I don't care what benchmark you use, that's failure from the world we come from. So I think a lot larger emphasis on career ready and critical thinking. And I'm a little disappointed. I don't think the business community's done enough. I think the professional educators are still living in that world. Everybody needs to go to a 4-year college. And I think those are 2 of the major issues that I see out there.
Thank you, Senator. Claire, what would you add?
Is this
It's on.
it's on? Good. I would kind of just emphasize the points that have already been made, kind of about the recognition that there are all of these external factors that affect student learning. I think that we are, for the first time, it feels like really acknowledging that, and also that there's the recognition, again, for the first time, that it simply costs more to educate those children. We haven't actually funded yet to educate them, but even the recognition that educating these children does require greater resources is an important step forward, which I hope to see resolved. One point in kind of listening to the conversation this morning, I think we need to recognize that when we're talking about low-income children, we're talking about the majority of the kids in this state. I mean, this is not a kind of a group off to the side. 60% of the kids in the state of Georgia qualify for the federal free and reduced lunch program. So the majority of kids in this state are in families that are experiencing some kind of financial stress, if not real distress. So again, coming back to that, we do really need a comprehensive and systematic approach to responding to the needs of these children if we want to have the workforce that the state needs to be really competitive in the future. We have to have an educated workforce. We cannot leave 60% of our kids behind. We just can't do that. So kind of just piggybacking on what everyone has said, kind of on a more policy side, one question that I have been kind of thinking a lot about and thinking about this afternoon, one area that I've wondered about is curriculum. You know, there's been a lot of attention paid to the people who are in classrooms, to teachers. We've changed teacher preparation, we've changed teacher licensure, we've changed teacher professional development and evaluation. So we're focusing on who is delivering instruction. Are we focusing on what the instruction consists of? And there are states that have really focused on that. Most recently, Louisiana has really taken the initiative to do some interesting things. And I suspect some districts here have really been very thoughtful about curriculum, but it's probably uneven. And it's who is teaching and what is being taught. And so I would say that may be an issue or an area that requires a little more attention.
Dr. Green, do you have something to add to that? Because I know y'all have been doing a lot of curriculum work in DeKalb County.
Well, yes, I mean, we are.
And what does that really mean for folks
process.
that aren't educators? Like what?
It's what is taught, how it's taught, and the standard upon which it is based, and the level of engagement, the relationship that the curriculum as it's delivered, the way in which it engages the student and teacher in a collaborative effort to aspire to higher learning. But we are in the process of developing our own curriculum. We obviously with the Georgia milestones in mind, but we have gone about this journey. We're about well over halfway through with a curriculum that is built primarily by our teachers with our students in mind, the students that we serve in mind. So it to that extent, it is customized in a sense to the population that we serve. But at the same time, it has a very keen eye on 21st century learning expectations, 22nd century now, we can probably talk about learning expectations and differentiation according to learning style. We're still in the infancy stages because we've just finished the core subject areas, math, science, English, and social studies, and part of the CTAE component. We're now in the writing as we speak the elective courses and the other components of the CTAE. But I do strongly believe that curriculum can serve as a vehicle to build relationships with between student and teacher, and between teacher and the rest of the staff, a common anchor pin, if you will, around the pull and push for higher learning, whether that's career or college or military readiness. And we're in the midst of that as we speak.
Dr. Kelly Ditzel with the Southern Education Foundation. There's a lot of talk about, oh, we have a question. Hi, and tell us who you are.
Susan Percy, Georgia Trend Magazine.
Hi, Susan.
My question, and I realize it's a sticky one, but when you're talking about looking at the curriculum, what's being taught, how do you go about, navigating all the political kind of considerations? I mean, so that, people aren't worried about whether Harry Potter is on the school library shelves or you're teaching a biology class. I mean, obviously there's room for public input, but how do you make sure that it is, beneficial?
Well, it's not textbook or topic driven necessarily. So I think you're alluding to the kind of debates around different types of text that may create controversy, but it's more so about the thinking process, the critical thinking. It gives a lot of flexibility, but it's more so aimed at very much looking at where the student is developmentally and what kind of intellectual engagement is necessary to keep the student challenged, at the same time not overwhelmed. And that's what we're looking at. We're doing learning walkthroughs to more so look at how the instruction is taking place. One of the things that I noticed when I first came to DeKalb, and that's not unique to Georgia or DeKalb, but if students are engaged in a classroom experience, it's easy to almost convince yourself that you're up with the rigor of what's happening in the world, but you may not be. You may have lost touch with the standard has increased in the challenge. But as long as everyone's getting along, then the teacher is giving instruction and the students are responding. But it could be at a very low level compared to where the expectation of rigor needs to be. And so we're going through a kind of evolution, if you will, about where does the rigor meter need to be to get a student ready developmentally for what they're going to face after their experience with us. And so it's really about that kind of conversation and not which textbook, whether Harry Potter's on the shelf or not, or that whole thing. But it's really about the kind of intellectual engagement and whatever text allows that to happen is not necessarily the focus.
Fran, you had something to add?
Yeah, I think 12 years ago I passed a bill, the bridge bill, for the first time we had career pathways. And I will tell you right now, the career pathways in the state of Georgia are weak. I think that the department has just brought in SREB to look at some of their pathways. And what Steve's talking about here, it's about critical thinking. It's about rigor, math, and English embedded in what you're teaching. And that's why projects-oriented things, particularly for career readiness, are so important. Because I'll tell you right now, you go back and you go look at one of these pathways that has critical thinking with rigor in English and math, and good luck if you can solve some of these problems that these young people are doing today. So I think that's what it's about, is don't make it too easy. We talk about dumbing down and that type of thing. And right now the state's in the process of, Richard Woods could probably comment on this better than I can, or Alan, you can, because you're familiar with it somewhat as well. But I think there's 7 or 8 pathways that are being worked on right now. So that's the key, because that's what employers are looking for. The social skills plus people that can critically think. That's the biggest complaint we get when they come out from high school, and they're not ready, okay, to perform at that point in time. They may graduate high school, but that doesn't mean they're ready to do anything.
I know I learned a lot better by doing things and actually accomplishing stuff rather than memorizing things. Martha?
I wanted to follow up with Senator Miller. Why do you think the pathways are weak the way they are now?
I don't think they go in depth enough. They don't. I think they skim the surface in a lot of cases. And I think they would tell you that from the department at this point. I mean, that's one of the reasons they're revamping. They realize it. If you contrast it with some of the other states. And the main thing is what Steve said. You have to have the rigor. You have to have the young people. Look, we got all these people that graduate from high school. Look at the remediation level at our college levels. Somewhere between 20, 40, 60% of these kids are taking remedial classes. You think we got a problem? So that's my whole point. If you can embed it in there and get them, and it also gets them engaged. I mean, people learn different ways. The biggest issue we have really is these kids that are bored, particularly in middle school. We got to get them before that. And we're trying to do some things different. I think Senator Tippins, wasn't he here this morning?
No, he couldn't come.
Okay, but I think Senator Tippins, he has a bill, for example, the bridge bill I talked about with the pathways. He now has an aptitude type thing he wants to put in to guide these kids, because by 9th grade, again, going back to the bridge bill, every kid has to have an individual graduation plan. Well, a lot of these kids, they don't have a clue what's out there, and their parents don't have a clue what's out there. And this will help guide them if they get their interest, their aptitude, that kind of thing. So I think it's a good step that way. But we've got to get the young people engaged in middle school. We can forget about it.
I would like to emphasize a point that you just made, and that's in regard to remediation and developmental education. And that is a huge gap. We have a report that recently came out that digs into that and talks about, it breaks it down by ethnicity and low-income students and first-generation students as well. But that clearly is a problem that
Major.
high schools, K-12, needs to be more proactive in working with post-secondary so that we're not wasting these students' time and money. And most that are in those courses don't finish. They don't, for a variety of reasons, including cost. They don't finish.
We mandated it for 12th grade 12 years ago, and finally we're getting people to do it. We really need to drop it down to 11th grade or whatever we have to do to get these young people ready, because they're just wasting money. We don't pay for it anymore at the college and university level. We used to pay for it. We don't do that anymore. So the key is, we give somebody a product out of K-12, we need to do a better job of preparing that product.
Well, one way we describe kind of that whole conversation around giving people the opportunities they deserve to find their way in school and that sort of thing is this watchword of equity in education. And, darn if I still can't quite define that. But Kelly, I wanted to ask you to sort of try from your perspective, and then we'll talk a little bit more about kind of the resources issue as relates to that, but it's much bigger than just funding or whatever, right?
So to your point of this being kind of a challenging topic, bear with me, I'm going to read a definition that we have been working through organizationally, because we are really thinking about, this is the work that we do, but how do we describe it? So equity exists when race is no longer the most reliable predictor of student success, and that systems work to ensure that each child receives what they need when they need it to develop to their full academic and social potential. And so with that, it's acknowledging that systems are important, right? It's not just about that individual student, but these schools that they're within that directly impact their opportunities and what they're exposed to and able to do, that all students should be able to have that full potential, right? As the Chief Turnaround Officer said, if we really want to talk about all kids, we need to dig into the differences and not just in regard to equality, but actually acknowledging differences and providing what's needed when.
The idea that some kids may need sort of more help to catch up academically or more types of support to be able to even focus on academics in the first place.
I think it digs back to those non-academic factors as well. So if we think about early childhood education, and I'm remembering Dana from this morning talking about the whole health focus and the lack of OBGYNs and therefore prenatal care. So it's not, I do not want to suggest that there's something innately missing or inept in students dependent upon race or income. But it's the environment that they're within. If you don't have all these different things in place that other students, most often in more affluent neighborhoods, which most often are white, have, then that results in all these different factors that start very early in one's childhood. And as that perpetuates and you're in schools that don't have as much funds, and we know it depends on how the funds are used, then these things just coexist on top of each other, and teachers that may have less experience and less, like, all these different resources do matter, right? And it's not just cost, but what these children are exposed to adds upon itself that results in these differences.
So Claire, in your mind, what's the state's role in sort of trying to address some of these gaps and make these opportunities not so much equal, although we want that too, I guess, but equitable in meeting students' needs depending on what they are?
Well,
And that involves resources.
Part of my job is
and-
to wear the
Yes.
funding hat,
Yes.
since I'm with the Georgia
You
Budget
took my,
and Policy
notion.
Institute, yes.
The money rate.
Yes, I'm the money lady.
And then we'll ask Fran where to find it, right?
He's got the answers. Well, in terms of resources, I mean, funding does matter. And our districts right now are, they're under considerable financial stress. We are not yet fully funding the QBE formula, our funding formula. They've made progress. Austerity is smaller than it has been, but there is still an austerity cut. At the same time, the state has shifted the entire cost of health insurance for non-teaching staff onto districts. That's an annual tab of $430 million. The state is also shifting most of the cost for student transportation onto school districts. School districts in 2017 spent $884 million on student transportation. The state added or contributed about $130 million of that, slightly less than 15%. That's considerably less than it's been in previous years. So districts are under considerable financial constraints. And as the needs, we surveyed districts this summer. And I did follow-up interviews with superintendents, and the experiences of Dr. Green are the case among his peers across the state. I heard over and over again that students' needs are growing and they're really struggling. How do they best meet these needs? Rural communities, we haven't seen property values come back, so local revenues are still down. That's just a difficult challenge. I think one of the other things is really trying to hone in, kind of going on to that question of efficiency. We need to do a better job of systematically identifying the schools and the districts that are moving the needle and identifying those best practices. We have 4 Research One institutions here in this state. We have people with the technical skills to really do sophisticated analysis, to really help district and state leaders understand what is making the biggest difference. How do we most effectively use our resources? And again, we see there are states that are doing that are being much more thoughtful about evaluation and using evaluation to inform policy decisions. And I think that that's a space where Georgia can move, to really maximize both current resources and hopefully additional resources in the future.
I want to ask Dr. Green about that, the equity question and also the resources question from a local district perspective.
Well, yeah, I think we all, I've been in New York City, superintendent in Kansas City, here in DeKalb now from a school district perspective, and also, as you know, with the College Board, working on equity there. For me, equity, by definition, is reading, recognizing, responding, and reallocating based on need. So those 4 R's I'm adding, they read, recognize,
Write that down. I want to know that.
respond,
Yeah.
and reallocate. So we're doing that. We're very candid about reallocating resources where the need is greatest in DeKalb schools, and our budget will reflect that. The one that's coming up and the one that we've done before, we've issued before. Certainly, there's a baseline, kind of the RTI model, response to intervention, where every student gets a certain amount of support and investment, but then we look at where is the need after that. Where's the need the greatest, and how do we mobilize resources around those schools to try to lift them up?
What's an example of
An
maybe something you
example
might?
of a school or the resources.
Well, both.
The resources can come in the form, and it's customizable in the form of additional paraprofessional. It could come in the form of a social worker. It could come in the form of a school psychologist. We have created an entire department called School Student Supported Intervention, a deputy who reports to me, who has, under her auspices, or the school social workers, the school psychologists, and the counselors work with her. But we find ourselves, based on what the school tells us it needs, mobilizing resources, and we also reach out to external partners. We're finding ourselves needing more and more to invite partners who bring critical skills, Kids Doc on Wheels, for instance, and for instance, at Snapfinger and at Farrington and at schools like that that have an additional struggle beyond just the cognitive academic struggle, the daily life struggle, to bring support around them. And so we are not very bashful about reaching out to pull in partners that have certain resources to help us. Big Brothers, Big Sisters, 100 Black Men, YMCA, faith-based organizations, et cetera. We're very intentional about that. And we've started to see some results, but that's still a labor-intensive endeavor. It requires more staff time. It requires more energy, and so it's kind of like gymnastics, the degree of difficulty. A difficult stunt requires more, and we have to look at that. What is the degree of difficulty that we've got to overcome to help a student in this part of our district achieve as well as a student in another part of our district, to create a level playing field and opportunity? That's the challenge and the struggle. And it's an ongoing struggle.
And Fran, do you want to say a little more maybe about kind of the resource issue and where you think we are and where you think we should go in the state?
again,
Not that it's all about money.
No, it's not all about money, but I do think that you have to be right with the times, and we're not right with the times. We're dealing with the formula from the 1980s. Some would say maybe from the 1940s it came possible in 19. We've never fully funded QBE, whether Democrats or Republicans were in charge, so that's been a given. But I do think too we have to look at efficiency, and we've got to be realistic with people. I mumbled to Steve here a minute ago. I said, I think it was 4 years ago when I was in charge of retirement, I put a bill out in order to look at the teacher retirement system. I believe we just put $400 million in the teacher retirement system. I believe that's the number we just put in. And there has not been the political will to take the teacher retirement system, do what we did with state employees, and put a hybrid program together with a base pension, if you will, and then 401k or 403 it would be on top of it, which is just exactly what we did for state employees. And that's strictly because of politics. And that's for new teachers only, not current teachers. But if we're going to be able to pay the current teachers what we tell them we're going to pay them 20 years from now, and plus teachers aren't hanging around for 20 years now. They're not hanging around for 10 years anymore. And you can vest a 401k probably in 5 years. So, you get that kind of opposition until you get to the crisis mode. We're pretty well to the crisis mode. And the example I will give you, several years ago, I found out that we owed the federal government, I think it was $700 or $800 million, because we were borrowing money to pay unemployment. And I did a bill with Charlie Bethel and some other folks, and now we have $1.5 billion surplus in the unemployment trust fund. But until it was a crisis, nobody wanted to deal with it. And when you ticked off everybody in the room, the employer, the employee, everybody else, to make the thing work for the long run, you're probably doing something right. And we need to do the same thing in these kind of, I mean, that's $400 million. When she's talking about being $400 million short, well, guess what? We just found a bunch of your money right there if we take the necessary steps. So, again, you have to have the political will to do it. And that's Republican and Democrat. It doesn't matter. Nobody's dealt with it, just like the unemployment thing. But I think we are going to have to deal with it because we can't afford it going forward. And we can then plow more money back to Steve for putting in the classroom.
Can I just add to that, because I think a question was raised in an earlier session about whether throwing money at the situation works. And if you do it the right way, it does. The resources do help. We had 25 schools 2 years ago on the focus priority list. We identified certain schools as internally we call it. I put them on triage. We use another horizon schools, but we treated it like it was intensive care situation. 25 schools on the focus priority list. We removed 5 schools last year, 8 schools this year. So we've cut the list in half. If you want to use that benchmark, and I have my questions and my debate about whether that's how valid necessarily and fair that is, but that's the rules of the game. And so you cut the number of schools in half in 2 years by mobilizing the resources around them and raising their improvement, their achievement, if that's going to be the benchmark. And others of those schools are within a few points. 9 of those schools within a few points of coming off. I think you start to see progress, and we see that as a wise investment.
Questions?
Just wanted to ask Dr. Green, with so much going on in terms of, like you mentioned, the labor intensiveness of gathering community partners to help out and things like that. And as Claire mentioned, some students just cost more to educate than others. Do you think the role of public schools is changing? I mean, do you think that some schools are having to do more than they would have historically done for kids?
Absolutely, absolutely, and we're being called on. And I don't say that, I don't. How do I say this? I welcome the challenge with the support. In other words, if that's what's needed, I don't have a problem arranging the situation so that we can best serve students of need and families of need. As long as, again, the support is there. What starts to come up in the conversation is, why are you doing social service work? Well, if somebody else will, I would support them. But if that's not going to happen, we'll step in the gap for children. So that's kind of where philosophically we can have the debate about who should provide the service. But right, more and more schools are being called upon to step into the gap and provide the social service work in addition to the instructional service work.
The state actually last year. Vincent Fort had SB 30, and where we were going to have a grant program in order to provide a lot of these wraparound services. And example being what the city of Marietta schools have done and how they've got all the partners involved, and they've improved their graduation rate for the 4-year rate. I think it's 15%. I think I'm close. The 5-year rate was or 20% or something like that by doing all these wraparound services. So there's been an awareness of it. We passed the bill out of the Senate. It's over in the House. It got through rules, but it didn't get taken up on the floor, so it will be recommitted to the Education Committee in the House. But there's an awareness from the state. The analogy I'll give you, it's sort of like regional transportation. If you've noticed lately, there's actually an awareness perhaps that's an issue in this state. The light bulb has gone off, whether it was the wraparound services here or regional transportation, throughout the state, urban, rural. When you've got people from Dahlonega saying that we need to support MARTA or whoever, we've made progress. Now, it's not as fast as some people would like, but my point being, We've got a bunch of these topics, education, transit, some other things like that. There's a lot bigger awareness about we're all in this together, for lack of a better term, okay? And that's a good thing. I've been down there 19 years, okay? You didn't have that kind of conversation 3, 4, 5 years ago. And it's just because it's not Republican or Democrat say, look, we got to deal with this. And the health care is another thing, for example. So I think that's pretty well, that bill, that's a bill that I hope we're going to do something with. Vincent was so excited because he actually passed a bill. I got to tell you that. So then he decided to run for mayor. That was his sound off. We're going to give you a send off here, Vincent. So anyway,
Kelly?
Yes, thank you. I think that's a good question. It's new in some places. There are areas that have been doing community schools and wraparound services, non-academic support, whatever language you want to use, for decades. Kentucky is an example, Austin, Texas. There are over 5 million students served in community schools nationally. So it's new in some places, but it has been happening and occurring. Like Kentucky actually passed state legislation in order to do so. Some cities are approaching it. So this is definitely a need and examples of how to do it. So it's not dependent upon the school itself to run it all, but to bring in partners.
Yeah, I know the Coalition for Community Schools is a national group. It's a good resource on that. Do you have a follow-up, Martha, or are you okay? Oh, yes.
A question about.
Tell us who you are again, please.
Sorry, Bridget Johnson from the Georgia School Boards
Hey, Bridget.
Association. With equity, it's not always about getting more money because, of course, we don't always get more money. So it's about taking resources maybe from one area and moving them to another.
Allocation.
Is that what you found in DeKalb? You had to take resources from, a certain area and move it towards maybe a lower performing area? And what was your pushback on that, if you had any?
Yeah, what does that look like at the local level? And then also, I think it's a question for state resources and how to divvy it up so that people aren't fighting against each other for this.
Right. I think we, prior to setting your priorities and matching up with a strategic plan that was designed by the community with the collaboration with the school board. Student access and equity is the number one strategic plan item in the strategic plan. So there wasn't much pushback when it came down to reallocating resources because it matched up to what the community who built the plan in the collaboration with the board said they wanted. It was just the discipline to do that and to begin to reallocate inside of our organization, which we started to do, and the willingness to, for instance, pay new teachers who come to us who go to our more difficult schools to have an incentive for them to do that. We also took that measure as well. So we did a number of different things that we're going to continue to work on, but there wasn't much pushback. Now, as you begin to squeeze tighter and tighter, yeah, you start to get some resistance, perhaps, or questions raised, et cetera, both on the academic side and on the facility side. So it's always a balancing act, and I think we try to modulate that tension, but at the same time, you have to keep being reminded of our mission and our vision. If we have 72% of our students on free or reduced lunch, then we have a moral, ethical obligation to make sure those students have what they need.
And you have to about the state level. The only way you're ever going to do this at the state level, you've got to redo the funding formula. If you start to piecemeal it, then somebody's ox is going to be gored. That's the bottom line. So if you're going to gore them here, you got to do something somewhere else. And if you try to piecemeal it, the state's going to have to step up and deal with this funding formula. I mean, it's been 30 plus years, folks, and there needs to be a hue and cry. That's when people react. And I'm hopeful whoever the next governor is, that we've got information there to do it. It's just going to be the political will to do it at the right time, and I'm hopeful this is going to be the right time going forward.
Dr. Green, you wanted to respond, but I want to ask Claire about that too.
Okay, I just wanted to. Are folks familiar with the RAMP plan that is now required by federal government? The resource allocation methodology plan that every school district must implement in order
Probably not.
Okay. Ramp is relatively new, but it's factoring into our budget building right now as we speak. Resource allocation methodology plan. Basically, before you go get your federal funding, you must allocate your local and state resources according to need in your district. You must have a plan to do so, and then the state will be called upon to actually monitor to make sure that the district has followed the plan. But you must come out with your a plan. It's embedded in your budget. It must be a plan that allows you to allocate resources based on your student population needs. That's kind of a thumbnail
Tell them
skit.
what percent of your money comes from the feds.
Oh, small percent. Yeah. No, we get federal funding, but it's about 5-10%.
And I just wanted to ask Claire, I mean, do you think there's anything that will sort of bring people together on the school funding issue? Is there a way to sort of address everybody's needs so that, you know, urban districts aren't fighting rural districts, suburban districts aren't fighting both of those, et cetera? I mean,
Well, I think that's partly just kind of speaking at the state level. I mean, one, if you look at how state dollars are distributed across districts, Georgia actually does a pretty good job of getting, you know, extra state dollars to low wealth districts. I mean, that's what equalization does. And you know, a number of external evaluations have said, you know, we do send more state dollars to districts with higher, clearly with lower property wealth, but those tend to be the districts with higher proportions of low-income students. The real kind of underlying issue is we're not investing enough. It's an adequacy issue. And so we really just need to kind of look holistically at the funding level. And just kind of, if we look back, you know, the state that everyone lifts up as, wow, this is our national leader when it comes to education is Massachusetts. What did Massachusetts do in 1993? They pushed through kind of the first real comprehensive standards-based reform, and at the same time, and this was led by the business community. I mean, the business community was out in front on this. They pushed through significant increase in funding. Every district got more money, but under their new formula, they funneled extra dollars to the highest need schools and districts. So no one came out a loser. But again, you know, those extra dollars went to those schools and districts in the greatest needs. But it was combined with, you know, a new assessment system, new standard system. They looked at curriculum, they looked at teacher. I mean, it was a real comprehensive reform. So I do think, going back to, you know, your polling data, if people understand it, they understand how the dollars are going to be used. There's clear accountability. I mean, Dr. Green has talked about transparency. That's one of the things that I'm not sure districts are always good at doing, is talking about how they're spending their dollars so that community members really understand where they're going and why they're going to particular schools. You know, Massachusetts was much better at that. And so I think there are lessons that we can draw from to move forward.
Lee, you had a question?
For Senator Miller, you sound that I was a little skeptical of the funding formula being changed anytime soon. Is that?
I would probably look for it at this point, unless I get pleasantly surprised when I show up on Monday. I believe it probably would not be until the next governor. But I do believe that we've got enough information out there that we can make a lot of good changes and get it a lot more current. I mean, just the poverty factor alone, the special needs part. I'm not sitting here and telling you I liked everything that I heard coming out of the commission, but that's the give and take. And if you can get consensus there with Republicans and Democrats on something like that, and there was both serving on it, there was superintendents on that, Alvin Wilbanks, for example. There was people from all types of educators were on that particular thing, except teachers, which I'm not saying that was proper, but there weren't. Maybe one. But my point being, if you can come up with something like that, we're going to have to do something. It's just that simple. I mean, I don't think we have a choice. But again, it's when we get to the crisis mode, we probably do our best work in the General Assembly.
We have a question over here. And how much time are we? Okay, go ahead, sorry.
Senator Miller, I just want to follow up on that, because I actually pulled up a story I wrote 2 years ago on the 56-page report that was delivered by this Blue Ribbon Education Reform Commission to the governor's office. It contained, I believe, 58 recommendations. I haven't heard a word about it. Governor Deal was to act on it last legislative session, and I haven't heard one word about any of those 58 recommendations being passed, being considered, even being discussed. And as you mentioned, these are high-level this is a blue ribbon committee of some of the top minds, in education and business. And what's happened with that is just a task force that spent a lot of time.
I think, to answer your question, I go back to the Opportunity School District. I mean, this is just me, this is me making assumptions, okay? But I think when that went down 60 to 40, I think it took a lot of air out of the room for further reforms at this point. That's just my.
Those things dealt with teacher retention.
No, I'm not disagreeing with you, okay? What I'm saying is, it didn't become an ultimate priority at that point in time. You know, we've continued to do the criminal justice reform. There's now a lot of emphasis on transportation when you hear about that. You're going to hear probably about something with income tax cuts, probably, because we benchmark ourselves against North Carolina, who has done that. You pick it, okay? Do I see that as a priority going into this session? No, and that's why I say to you, I think the next governor, whoever that happens to be, the information's sitting there to be dealt with. There's good data and there's good information, good basis to do things. I would hope the next governor is going to pick that up and run with it. And I guess really that's really where we are. I don't know what's going to happen this session. Some people say it'll be short. Some people say it'll be long. You know, it seems like half of my body is running for something statewide between you and me. So I'm not really sure who's going to be there on Monday when I show up. So, but again, I just don't look for it to happen here in the upcoming year. I'm hopeful because I think we don't have a choice. And if we
Recommendations are still out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sure. And there may have been some we've acted on. I just can't tell you specifically. I think they are, because Dana's nodding her head there. I think we did deal with some of them. Those were probably the easier ones, because some of that stuff was low-hanging fruit, I believe. But the big ones I see really are the formula itself, teacher retirement, and going forward from there.
Claire?
Just say there was, I think probably the key piece, and this wasn't last session, it was
The first session.
the 2016, I think. They moved forward on the recommendations to increase salaries for pre-K teachers, and that
Right.
was really, really important. I mean, that was a revolving door. We were paying them so low. So that was something very positive that came out of the commission.
For example, some of us on that area alone, I'm disappointed we did not make quality-rated pre-K mandatory. We have such a small percentage that actually are quality-rated. I think you owe the public that. If your child's being brought to a school that's level 1 and somebody else is a level 3, you ought to know that when you bring your child there. I wanted it to be mandatory. It was not. But I think that's where we need to be going. As he said, transparency with people. Let them know where people stand. Guess what? You'll improve them when you're a level 1 and people down the street are a level 3. It's called competition.
Other questions before we get some final thoughts? So Kelly, I'll start with you, kind of some closing thoughts, you know. What's some words of wisdom on how we need to improve education in Georgia going forward, especially from your perspective and your organization's view?
I think it's critically important to acknowledge that addressing these issues are risky. I'm reminded of Maureen's question earlier in regard to teachers and what potentially happens when they speak up and do different things. We have a new fellowship program, Racial Equity Leadership Network, that is superintendents from across the South and a couple outside of that. And that's been a real topic of conversation, is what happens when teachers are exposed? How do you support people to act in these ways? And so acknowledging that exist, I think, is really important. And also, I think all these decisions become a lot more simple when we keep students in mind. So focusing on students and what's most important for them enables conversations to be had across political lines and differences, and when it's not about adults and teachers and different perspectives, but keeping what's best for students in mind is very critical. Something else I already mentioned is the community schools, as was echoed, was just lifted previously, and that's a really strong opportunity, acknowledging that schools can't and should not have to do it all, but there are real issues that do exist, and we need to support students and families in order to have the best opportunity, which really matters for all of us, and social and economic returns. I think it's 14-to-1, Children's Aid Society said you can get a return as high for wraparound in community schools. And then finally, I'll say language and storytelling. We need to do a better job of talking about what is working for public schools. there's so much negative conversation and choice and different things that are put out there, but we need to better tell the story of what is working and all the positive examples and benefits that are happening from teachers and educators every day for our students.
You know, when we were doing the Columbia Group report this past year, we had some focus groups. One was in a small town in Kentucky, London, Kentucky, coal country, edge of Appalachia. One was in Dunwoody, although it drew from...
That's lower Appalachia.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
L.A. Or Lower Alabama, the way they call it, Florida.
We're not using
Panhandle.
that word this week, Alabama.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, excuse me. Oh, gosh.
Well, you're not politically correct, let me tell you.
And I'm a Gamecock, so you know. But it was interesting to me to hear business leaders at the Georgia Chamber in Atlanta saying very similar things about what children need and some of the issues that need to be addressed, as you're saying here today, as the focus group of working class folks in Trump country in London, Kentucky were saying, that a diverse set of voters and parents in Dunwoody were saying. They were all saying the same things. And so I think that there's, again, I just wanted to emphasize the consensus thing.
Can I add one more quick fact?
Yeah.
And just to realize that students of color are the majority of students in public schools across the country. So we know low income is incredibly high as well, but in 2014, I believe we reached 50% for students of color as well, and that is something that has to be addressed, and just realize that this is who we're serving and what our students look like.
Dr. Green?
You know, for me, and it remains, you know, it's certainly an educational issue, but underneath all that, or threaded throughout all that, is a human rights issue, a social justice issue that needs to be exposed and addressed. We have a constitutional commitment in this country for free and appropriate education for all. And so I think we need to cut through, and we have a history that has to be a social injustice has occurred around students of color, students of poverty, students who are both. We're trying, you know, and this country has made a constitutional commitment to correct that, and we need to be about the business of making those corrections and never take our eye off the ball.
Thank you, sir. Fran, nugget of wisdom?
I guess two things. We need to give Steve a better product when we send him to elementary school, which means we need to invest more resources into pre-K. In fact, we've got a bill sitting over in the House as well for about $40 million additional money over 3 years if we increase the lottery proceeds to go to pre-K into the Hope Scholarship. I do believe that it's not a good thing when they can correlate reading proficiency at the end of third grade and who's going to go to prison. That is not a good thing. So I think we need to put more emphasis on young people at the front end and get the resources there. And at the back end, when people graduate from high school and such, as people know, I'm a big proponent of needs-based education. To be fair to everyone, okay? We've got the Hope Scholarship, and we've got the Hope Grants. But when Georgia Gwinnett College starts out with 13,200 students, and within 30 days they're down to 12,400 because somebody doesn't have $500, $600, $700, $800, that's tragic after we just spent $120,000 educating them. So we've got to find a funding source for that, for people. And quite frankly, a lot of that is minority-based, what we're talking about here.
Need-based aid and higher ed, there's a
Yeah.
whole series of articles for you.
So I think both ends of the spectrum there, if you will. But the front end particularly has always bothered me. We put all this emphasis on hope and all these other type things. But if that child still can't read at the end of third grade, he's not proficient. By the way, 1 in 3 children are proficient in Georgia, and nationally probably, in reading at the end of third grade. That doesn't give him a whole lot to work with by the time they get to middle school. And we got to be honest about that, and we have to deal with it.
Claire, final words?
I second everything that
Yeah.
everyone has said.
Amen, amen, amen.
Yeah, I know. There's the advantages of being at the end of the line. I would say, as I said, we did a survey this summer, and I did follow-up interviews with some of the superintendents, and I was talking to a superintendent in South Georgia and kind of asking him a wrap-up question, kind of like, what can we do that would make it the most difference? And he had gone on at length about kind of all the academic issues and stuff, but he said, you know what? He said, I need parents with good paying jobs. That would make more difference than anything else. I need parents with good paying jobs. And that's, because he went on to say, because then I have parents who are home at dinner. They are home, and they're available to ask, how was your day at school? They're available to assist with homework. They are engaged in the lives of their children, the academic lives of their kids. But I think that really speaks to kind of the broader issues. We can't look at schools kind of solely as this kind of academic enterprise, even if we're talking about wraparound services. Ultimately, we want fewer families living in poverty. So to see this kind of more holistically, that education is one piece of building a solid middle class and thinking about what other kinds of policies support strong families. So kind of going to the early childhood piece, we've got to have strong child care. It is a critical work support, but also it's a two-generation. If you have really good child care, then the children going into pre-K programs have a stronger literacy foundation. We can look at things like an earned income tax credit. That has support across the board from economists on both sides of the aisle. That financial aid is critical, and for families, parents in their 30s who don't have that degree and realize, I get why I have to go back to school and get that degree. Well, you know what? They can't get the Hope Scholarship.
No.
They can't get it right now, and we don't have a needs-based program. So thinking more holistically about not just how do we build strong schools and strong students, how do we build strong families, and kind of situating the conversation about schools in a broader framework.
Thank you all so much. Any final questions or comments? I think we need to wrap up. But Martha?
I just
Squeaky
have
wheel.
A quick question, sorry, about the needs-based scholarship. Claire, other states do it, right? So where do they find the funding if there's not funding in Georgia? Where do they find
A lot of
it?
it is state funding.
Okay, so they allocate money
yes.
for it.
Understand, though, in the southern states, I'll just use that for an example, we provide more aid dollar-wise than anybody, but we don't do the needs-based. The needs-based aid today in our state is being done by the institutions, the Panther grants at Georgia State. University of Georgia has set up a program of needs-based and merit of $1.5 billion. Georgia Tech's got the Tech Promise. So again, we're doing it, but not through the state funds at this point. But again, I think in order for us to, and forget the humanitarian aspect if you will for a minute, in order to get the workforce we need, if you want to put it in business terms, if we don't educate people that are critically think when they walk out and pay for it, and guess what? All those jobs and why site selections picked us the last 5 years, and yes, we got the port, and yes, we've got the airport, and that puts us ahead of everybody else in the South. But if we don't have the workforce, that golden goose will not be here maybe a decade from now. So it is critical that we do this, and particularly with people, quite frankly, of color, because those are the ones that are being left out. And I'm talking about somebody that has to work when they're in school, like maybe 15 hours a week. It's got to have a minimum grade point, whether it's 2, 2.3, whatever it happens to be. Everybody gets skin in the game. But when, I think my memory serves me, 26% of our parents and families in this state make less than $30,000. Well, good luck for them being able to put much money towards their child's education. And to me, that's a tragedy.
But do you see an appetite in the General Assembly to start some kind of a?
I think so, and I'm not talking casino gambling, by the way, either. But I think if we can find a funding source, and I'm working on that, Martha, as I speak. And it's not casino gambling.
Okay.
So you go, roll the dice on that one.
Well, we have to wrap up, but these folks are always available to you and as great resources. So thanks so much for being here, everybody, and thank you all for what you do in the audience, too. Yep.
How about a round of applause for our panel, folks? Great job. Thank you, folks. I'm Steve Dollinger, President of Georgia Partnership. I have just a few comments and information for you to wrap up here. By the way, Martha, Georgia is one of 2 states that does not have needs-based statewide program. We have some programs like the REACH project, some universities have, but not statewide. So we're one of 2 states that, and last year, the other one? New Hampshire, I believe. Last year's top 10, it's one of those issues. So you can go back and it's online, so you can go back and get that. A couple of things. Very importantly, please fill out this evaluation form. It's in your packet. We really do look at this and take to heart what you say. It helps us make this a little better every year. So give us your feedback. Matt will continue to be in communication with you as he was this year about, okay, here are the top 10, who would you like to hear from, what kind of voices, and that helps us put together the speakers and the panels and the programs that we bring to you. So please fill that out and leave it on your table, or you can drop it on the table outside. Use us for a resource. Call Matt if you have a question, and he will get either Dana or me, or sometimes with some of you, Dana and I like to tag team, and we'll talk to you on the phone. It's kind of fun to go back and forth. We bring different perspectives to this. But we would like to be a resource for you, and I know sometimes you just want background information. What does this OSD stand for? What does it mean? We'd be glad to talk about those with you. So let us be your resource and give us a call. Matt will be sending you an email soon that will give you follow-up information, but also will let you know about when this video is on our website. I think interestingly enough, we've heard past state superintendent candidates and some legislative candidates that they will go online and look at the video of this program, and when you ask candidates questions, they'll pause the video and think about what their answer would be, and then hear what the expert's answer is. They may or may not agree with them, but it's a good piece for them or their staff to look at as they're putting together their education campaign. So the video will be coming out soon. Share that with your colleagues, or you can go back and use it, of course, for your own information. If you want additional top 10 hard copies, there's some more outside, or just call Matt and we'll be glad to get those to you. A couple times today it came up about the need for positive stories in education. You asked the state superintendent, what does he see as some need for clarification across the state? Well, Matt did an article recently that was published that if you'd like to get a copy of that, just talk to him. It gave 5 or 6 data points of where Georgia really is improving. You remember for so many years we had the brand that we were 50th, that we were last. Well, some of that brand still is out there, but you need to help us change that. We're in the middle of the pack. We're in the 30s, not where we want to be, but it's a whole lot better than being last like we were for so long. So that's it. We've got also the one-pagers. Matt heard from you that while you like the data and the research, it's in the top 10. If you'd like to have a little short take on that too, so we've got those one-pagers out there if you'd like to have those just for the quick reading. And you'll hear us talk more and more this year. Dana mentioned EdQuest. That's the first issue this year, kind of the outline for the top 10. It'll be an outline for our critical issue forums. We'll be doing a road trip across the state this year. Come to some of your communities. We'll do about 8 stops with our new Economics of Education and the EdQuest. The EdQuest has hundreds of pages of research behind it, but those 7 buckets of issues of what Georgia needs to do to improve, and those stoplights you heard about. And we're working with gubernatorial candidates. We've met with some already and hope to meet with others. And we're telling them with those stoplights, if the ed policy is green, leave it alone, don't mess it up. If it's yellow, it may need to be leveraged or expanded. If it's red, that may be where you want to target your education policy issues. So hopefully that will be helpful to you too in your research and your focus areas on ed policy. But thank you for being with us for the 12th annual Media Symposium.